What if much of what we thought we knew about India's past was, well, maybe not quite the full story? Today, we're embarking on a truly fascinating deep dive. We're looking at pre-colonial India. For a long time, the, let's say, historical wisdom has often painted this picture of a largely static society, one that seemed disconnected from all the dynamic changes happening over in Europe. But a really rigorous academic paper by Frank Perlin steps in to challenge that entire notion. So our mission today is to unpack these long-held assumptions, and in doing that, reveal, well, a surprisingly vibrant, interconnected, and actually evolving South Asia. We want to explore how new evidence and perspectives are genuinely rewriting history here. We're going to look at economic systems, trade, even the daily lives of people, just to understand the deep, irreversible changes that were really happening.
That's exactly right. Traditionally, scholars have treated pre-colonial India as, well, fundamentally separate. A society existing almost in a different time and space from the Europe that, birthed the Industrial Revolution. This deep dive, I think, will show you that this perspective might be far from the truth. It actually obscures a much richer, more dynamic reality.
Okay, so let's start right there. This traditional view, the static India idea, can you give us a bit more sense of what that looked like in scholarly circles? What were the core ideas this paper is really pushing back against?
Absolutely. Many influential scholars, even the ones who acknowledged India had some kind of economic history, still described its non-agricultural production as, and this is a quote, an immemorial system functioning on the level of a high equilibrium.
Okay, high equilibrium. What does that actually mean in plain terms?
It essentially means they believe that while things might change superficially, nothing fundamentally changed in India's economic structures for centuries. It was all just sort of stable.
Stable, but not really developing.
Exactly. Some even went as far as suggesting that a distinct economic sphere, like we understand it, only really emerged there with the arrival of the British. And this deeply ingrained static view, as Frank Perlin's paper points out, it stems from a set of assumptions. Assumptions that often viewed Indian history as essentially separate, autonomous, a local experience sharply contrasted with the history of Europe. The woman with this way of thinking, these sort of ingrained beliefs, they've actually misdirected attempts to understand pre-colonial history. It often makes colonialism seem like Odysseus ex machina, like this sudden external force, almost like the divine intervention that just magically appeared to bring all the meaningful change.
Right, as if nothing important was happening before. So if that's the traditional view, how does this paper start to reframe our understanding, especially when it comes to a term like proto-industrialization, which, we often hear used for Europe's path?
Yeah, that's a really important question. The concept of proto-industrialization itself, well, Perlin argues it's useful for gathering data, sure, but he criticizes it for being too teleological.
Teleological, meaning it assumes everything was heading towards one specific goal, like European industrialization.
Precisely. It assumes a predetermined outcome, that everything was always leading to European-style industrial capitalism. It tends to bundle different phenomena together as parts of just one undifferentiated process. It can also decontextualize studies, maybe focusing too narrowly on, say, the family unit without really integrating it into the larger commercial frameworks, the payment systems, the export markets of its time. So for this deep dive, Perlin actually prefers the term commercial manufacture.
Commercial manufacture, okay.
Yeah, just to refer simply to pre-factory industries of all kinds that were geared towards a commercial market.
Mm-hmm.
And he introduces proto-capitalism as a broader concept.
Proto-capitalism.
Right, to describe the rise of commercial capitalism more generally, which, as we'll definitely get into, was profoundly at work in India.
Okay, so just to make sure I'm getting this clear for everyone listening, commercial manufacture is more about how things were made for the market before factories popped up.
Exactly.
Whereas proto-capitalism is about the bigger system, how money, markets, capital were actually shaping the whole society.
You've got it. It's about moving beyond just looking for precursors to the Industrial Revolution, and instead recognizing the complexity and, frankly, the dynamism of India's own economic systems on their own terms.
That feels like a crucial distinction. So, okay, let's set aside that old image of a stagnant economy. What does this research actually tell us about the economic reality on the ground in pre-colonial India? What was really going on?
Well, what the paper reveals is, honestly, quite remarkable. Far from being stagnant, widespread commercial manufacturing in India was absolutely booming, often in tandem with significant urban growth, too.
Booming. So not just cottage industries, but something bigger.
Oh, definitely. We're talking about a sophisticated division of labor. You had towns handling the craft-skilled work, the luxury goods, and then the countryside focusing more on bulk products. And this wasn't static. It created an increasing interregional and town-country interdependence. Things were really interconnected.
That sounds much more dynamic.
And if we connect this to the bigger picture, it becomes clear that stagnation or deindustrialization, the failure to industrialize later on, that wasn't unique to India. That happened repeatedly throughout the early modern period in Europe, too. This wasn't some, peculiar Indian problem, but part of a comparative set of challenges within a much wider global context.
Okay, that's a really important point. It wasn't just an India thing. And you mentioned this dynamism wasn't just in textiles, right? It was transforming the very currency of daily life. This paper talks about a really profound transformation driven by a growing monetized economy.
Precisely. I mean, we're talking about massive international commerce, not just in goods, but in the means of exchange itself. Gold, silver, copper, even cowries, those little seashells. And get this, inedible almonds imported all the way from Persia.
Inedible almonds as currency.
As currency, yes. And this really challenges that old kind of simplistic idea that India was just a bottomless well where precious metals vanished, or that different currencies operated in totally separate economic spheres. These weren't just exotic trinkets. These different monetary media performed vital functions in India's expanding economies. Silver, copper, cowries, they were essential means of payment.
Payment for what, mainly?
For manufactured products, obviously, but also for key export crops like indigo and rice. And underlying this was what the paper calls a secular increase in the use and exploitation of large collections of dispersed labor, often based on relatively simple technologies, yes, but with growing sophistication in extending these commercial methods over ever larger distances.
Wow. And to support all this trade and payment, what kind of financial infrastructure are we seeing? Was it just informal agreements, or were there more, sophisticated systems in place?
The infrastructure was surprisingly robust, actually. We're talking relatively sophisticated monetary and financial institutions, banking houses, for instance.
Actual bank.
Yes, and bills of exchange called hundis. These were essentially promissory notes, kind of like early checks that could be redeemed elsewhere, hugely important for long-distance trade. And accounting techniques were widely used across all levels of society. This wasn't just something for the great lords. Even village officials were using them.
Village officials.
Absolutely. And credit, too, was widely utilized. There were written contracts, interest charged, even among agricultural laborers and craft producers. It wasn't just big merchant deals.
So this implies a real level of financial literacy, or at least numeracy, even among ordinary people. They understood these concepts.
It certainly implies a widespread knowledge of quantity calculation, value attribution. I mean, think about it. You have records of money transfers from Maratha condottiere.
Condottiere, like those mercenary captains?
Exactly. These powerful military leaders operating across India. They're using bills of payment from local bankers that are payable in any part of India. That's a sophisticated network. Yeah. Or you look at the papers of bankers in Pune and you see money flowing between major towns all across the subcontinent. And crucially, this wasn't just confined to the elite. Even in regions sometimes considered backward, like the Maratha Deccan, villagers were engaged in frequent, albeit low-value, monetary transactions. They were paid daily wages in copper coins. It shows a truly pervasive market economy, right down to the local level.
That's incredible. It paints a very different picture. And what about the coins themselves? How was coin production adapting to meet this growing demand? Were new kinds of money emerging?
Indeed. The very production of coin was itself transformed in this period. We see the appearance of mass-produced, often lower-quality copper monies.
Lower quality. Why?
Likely to meet the sheer volume of demand for small transactions. More mints started operating. And significantly, many were under private entrepreneurial management, especially popping up in local market towns. This suggests a really vigorous, highly monetized local market for coin itself. People needed it for daily business.
And merchants were using the system too.
Critically, yes. It points to the prevalence of advance payments made by merchants to industrial and agricultural producers. Paying up front for goods to be delivered later. It was a system the European companies explicitly tried to extend later to bind producers to them. And even those seemingly archaic non-metallic media, like the badam, the almonds, and the cowries, they continue to circulate among what the paper calls small people in major industrial regions like Surat and Bengal. This wasn't backwardness. It indicated vigorous exchange economies operating at every single level.
Okay, so if pre-colonial India, right up through maybe the 17th century, was this dynamic, then what about the 18th century? Because that period is so often described as one of decline, chaos, the collapse of the Mughal Empire. How does this paper square that traditional narrative with the dynamism you've been describing?
That's actually one of the paper's most insightful contributions, I think. Traditionally, yes, political decentralization, the weakening of the central Mughal state was seen as basically synonymous with economic decline, chaos, breakdown. However, this deep dive suggests something different. It suggests that this decentralization actually went hand in hand with a broader process of localization. Power became more distributed, yes, but this coincided with an increase in the density of economic life locally.
Density of economic life, meaning more activity.
Exactly. You see new regional states emerging, smaller lordly courts dispersing into the countryside, and what the paper calls a urban economy developing.
Urban? Like rural urban?
Precisely. A blend where urban functions, manufacturing, cash cropping, were becoming increasingly interwoven into rural life itself. So rather than just chaos and decline, it was more like a complex reorganization, one that often fostered local economic vitality in new ways.
That certainly challenges the idea that the colonial powers simply stepped into some kind of vacuum, doesn't it? It sounds like there was already a really complex, evolving situation on the ground.
Absolutely. European companies weren't entering an empty stage at all. Perlin argues they created what he calls an open frontier of disruption long before any formal conquests.
How? Through what kinds of disruption?
Through military interference, selling weapons, making alliances with local rulers, playing factions off against each other. These were disruptions, yes, but they were insertions into an already active and sophisticated economic landscape, not the creation of activity itself.
And the changes in coinage you mentioned earlier, the lower quality coins, the private mints.
Right, those weren't necessarily just signs of chaos, according to this view. They can also be seen as signs of a commercializing economy, adapting and responding to local needs for more currency, especially small denominations. Interestingly, these developments actually paralleled similar trends in 18th century Europe, where informal or even illegal money making often fulfilled a similar function when official supply couldn't keep up. The crucial point is that the use of money was spreading. It was reaching new sections of the population, not just for big deals, but for the tiny daily transactions of ordinary people.
And the global textile market must have played a huge role in shaping this evolving dynamic, especially as European companies started to exert more influence and control.
Oh, definitely. The international textile market became increasingly competitive. More regions around the world were entering production. And what did that mean for India? It meant European companies, seeking to secure their supply and profits, tighten their control over Indian producers.
Tighten control how?
Often through harsher terms, sometimes increased coercion, maybe even violence, driving down labor costs to stay competitive globally. This isn't a story of two separate worlds colliding abruptly. Perlin describes it as a continuous process of developments, linking the pre-colonial and early colonial periods. Local production systems became more and more entangled with European demands and European capital.
Entangled, so interconnected across vast distances.
Profoundly so. You have cotton grown in Awadh, right in central North India, moving all the way east to Bengal just to supply the textile production there, much of which was for export via the companies. You have banking establishments based in Bengal financing the cultivation and transport of goods across huge distances, crossing different political jurisdictions. By the late 18th century, you really can't separate Indian history, the history of the European companies, and the history of international commerce anymore. They had become, as the paper says, inextricably fused.
So the really big picture here, the major takeaway, seems to be that pre-colonial India was far from static. Its own internal societal growth, its developing proto-capitalist relationships, actually in a way facilitated European involvement rather than being entirely separate from it. Is that fair?
That's a very good way to put it. It fundamentally shifts the understanding of how Europe eventually gained its hegemony.
How so?
Well, European commercial activity, initially, responded almost parasitically to the existing thriving commercial and industrial circuits they found in Asia. They tapped into what was already there. But over the course of the 18th century, the European maritime economies became increasingly able to pose their will, structure things to their advantage.
Okay, but then the big question remains, doesn't it? If India was so dynamic, had these proto-capitalist features, why didn't it industrialize in the same way Europe did? What explains the so-called failure?
That's the crucial point the paper leads to. The lack of large-scale fixed capital investments in pre-colonial India. Big factories, massive machinery that might seem like a sign of backwardness from a later perspective. But Perlin argues that was actually a hallmark of this entire global period, including in much of Europe before the late 18th, early 19th century. Economic development almost everywhere was more about the growth and control of circulating capital.
Circulating capital, like money, raw materials, goods moving around.
Exactly. Capital circulating over extensively dispersed labor forces rather than concentrating it in huge factories. So this means, very importantly, that the crucial question in India's failure to industrialize isn't necessarily about some inherent lack of potential. It lies more in how capital came to be organized and controlled during the 18th century, and specifically how European penetration and the structures they imposed may have actively inhibited or distorted indigenous paths towards industrialization. It becomes less about would India have industrialized on its own, and more about how its existing potential was channeled or perhaps suppressed.
Wow. What a deep dive this has genuinely been. It really does challenge so many preconceived notions about pre-colonial India. We've peeled back layers of assumptions here to reveal this complex, dynamic, globally connected economy long before formal colonialism really took hold.
Absolutely. And the lesson here isn't just about India, is it? It's really about how rigorous historical research, that commitment to what Perlin calls the ruthless pursuit of the discipline of context, can dismantle these long-held historical narratives, these dogmas. It just reminds us that our understanding of the past is never truly fixed. It's always open to reevaluation as we find new evidence or new ways of looking at old evidence.
So thinking about this, what does this mean for you listening right now? I think it means looking beyond those simplistic narratives. We often get narratives of inevitable progress or inevitable decline, especially when we try to understand how societies evolve and interact on a global scale. It kind of invites you to consider how even today, things that seem like purely local economic activities are often deeply embedded in these vast, complex international relationships that are shaping their trajectory, maybe in ways we don't always see. So maybe next time you hear a broad, sweeping statement about any historical period or any culture's development, perhaps just pause and ask yourself, is this really the full story? Or is there a deeper, maybe more interconnected, more complex reality waiting to be uncovered? One that might completely change how you see the world.